You just heard Behind Space from In Flames. We went there. We're doing In Flames.
It's finally happened, Mark.
This is Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And so we've tried to steer clear of we've debated In Flames for a while, and we just got back from Norway a couple weeks ago when we did the two episodes in a row from
from Art Noir.
Yeah, and then we went back to America temporarily, and then we just could not leave Scandinavia alone. And we decided, as long as we're going to finally take the leap into the controversial In Flames, one of the most, I think, hated and loved at the same time extreme metal bands, we decided to bring in a special guest who is joining us for the very first time. So please welcome.
Hi, I'm Monica.
And tell us your full name.
Monica Jackomino.
Jackomino. There'll be notes later in a test.
Well, we wanted to bring in a younger generation of metal.
Yeah. Because
I'm staring 40 in the face. Jason's just a little bit behind me, and Monica, you're not even 30.
Nope.
Yeah.
So I thought it was interesting also that you came from this stuff like from a completely different. Like I was death metal guy, and as soon as 2000s came, metalcore, all that kind of stuff, I was like, fuck all this stuff, I hate these kids, and you were one of those kids, but you're actually cool. So I'm eating my words now.
Okay.
But yeah,
you used it as a gateway, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I guess give us kind of how you approached the whole Swedish melodic thing with In Flames.
Well, I would say when I very first started listening to extreme music in general, it was magazines because I lived out in the woods and I didn't have the internet. And then
Very, very cult, living in the middle of the woods with metal.
yeah. And then I started getting involved in the hardcore and punk scene in Traverse City. Although I would say that it was probably leaning towards that
The more
2000 metalcore.
Gotcha.
and you did
sound.
bookings and stuff too at that point, right? Like booking bands.
I started booking shows in 2003. And I really got into the scene at that point and just listened to that music more just because I was involved in it. But when I first got into music, I just talked to a bunch of online snobs, and so I was a little bit snobby about it. But In Flames was definitely one of my first, extreme underground
Kind of like a
bands.
gateway drug type of band.
Totally.
Yeah.
I would say so.
when I first met Monica, we talked, I think, a good 45 minutes about Edge of Sandy, which
Yes.
Yeah.
I know
It's
I
my
can
favorite
count
band.
5 people that actually know who the band is.
Yeah,
Let alone somebody that's,
and-
10 years younger than me. It was pretty awesome
Sure.
to actually, I don't know, that's just a weird band to throw out there. Nobody usually knows who the hell Edge of Sandy
Right.
is, so.
Yeah, or cares enough to want to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, yeah.
They might have heard it, but and you came in on Colony, correct?
Colony and Clayman, yeah. I think I might have actually heard a couple songs on Clayman first, and I got them about the same time.
Yeah, because if you said 2000, Clayman's 2000, Colony was 99, so that makes about that.
Yeah. I think I got a computer in 2000, and that's when my whole music world started opening up. So.
Yeah. And what's interesting, for us, I think, is pretty much after Clayman is when I sort of exited In Flames for the most part.
As did I, although
I mean, there's
curiously,
choice songs
I've
here and
got
there that I
all the other stuff. I don't know why or
Yeah.
how. I don't remember paying that much for it.
I got them used for $2 or $3. Reroute to Remain and Soundtrack to Your Escape and stuff like that.
I even have Come Clarity.
I do not. I have a burn of that somewhere.
Okay,
but that's
which is I think it's an all white cover too, so the name is very
wonderful.
apropos.
Yeah, there you go.
I haven't seen the cover of that one.
Yeah,
That's terrible. I think that's where they're wearing all the white outfits and stuff.
I thought that was Reroute to Remain.
Yeah, well,
Maybe they took it. It might not write the same thing, so we can't begrudge them too much.
Yeah. And so when we get into definitely the second part, especially Monica will be able to give us, I think, a lot of creative insight into maybe some of the elements of that era that maybe Mark and I overlooked because we were too cult at that point, or too good for our own opinions. I was telling her she was
Jaded.
Yeah, we were jaded, and obviously we were in that pretentious kind of college. We know a lot about music and metal stage where and that's fine. It was just we had grown out of it, but at the same time, to bemoan somebody that opportunity to sort of come in through a band like In Flames would be kind of silly too.
Oh yeah, I mean, the older I get, the more respect I have for people that just actually give a shit about music.
Yep.
It's such a rarity that people actually care enough to research things.
Yeah.
And stick with it long term. So
you can't get all, I guess, trendy and cult and all that sort of stuff.
Or sanctimonious, because I heard Autopsy on their first record and you didn't hear it till you were 15 years later or something.
Yeah.
If you like them, that's cool now. I don't really care.
So Monica, welcome to the club is what we're saying, and we're happy to have you.
Thank you.
Now, Lunar Strain, the sort of beginning era of In Flames, what you just heard, Behind Space, it's kind of a calling card for these guys, I guess. It's a song I'm sure they'll play live, I don't know, till the end. I would imagine. I gotta guess it's still in their live show. They
the last time I
re-recorded it for
saw them
Colony.
was 2000, I think.
Yeah, I've seen them twice, and they've obviously, it's kind of one of the expected songs. It's the I
haven't seen them on their Monster Energy drink tours, or some of the other stuff they're on now, or what's the Vans thing festival,
Warp Tour.
Did
they play Warp Tour?
I'm thinking they might have
played-
played a third stage a couple years ago or something.
That's kind of weird. I think Warped Tour is usually more.
Is it more mainstream?
Punk rock
It's more the
oriented.
punk and
Maybe it's the Monster
mainstream.
Energy drink type thing that I'm thinking.
Or what about
of.
what was that Scion Fest?
It could have been
I
Scion.
think it was that Scion Fest. It was
Okay.
a bunch of metal bands that.
Or there's another energy drink sponsored thing that Slayer
the
and
Mayhem
Cannibal
Tour or
Corpse. Yeah,
something?
Yeah.
it might have been Mayhem Tour or something.
They might have done that a couple years ago, but
I'll be frank, I haven't really paid attention to anything In Flames has done in the last 5 or 6 years. They're just so kind of off the radar.
they keep morphing into Korn the more they age, so it's
Lots
kind
of
of bothers
Jonathan
me.
Davis lyrics.
Yeah.
But we like to remember them in the good days,
Yes.
the days of fond memories of
Well, and
Gothenburg
actually-
melodic Swedish death metal.
Yeah, Lunar Strain was pre Anders Frieden on vocals altogether, and back then this was like such a weird mishmash of, I mean, it was even like more incestuous than like the Stockholm scene, like how people like switched around with, you know, Michael Stane and
well, and let's I guess tell them the original lineup. You know, it changes in the first 3 records. It doesn't really stabilize until kind of after Jester Reis.
Yeah, Lunar Strain, we've got Michael Stane's on vocals, who everybody would probably know from Dark Tranquility. Then Jester Stromblad on guitar, Glenn Lindstrom, and Johan Larsson, and Carl.
Is it
we'll just call him Carl.
Carl.
Second guitar player, which that's the only record he's really on. But
Carl, the neighbor on what's that Adult Swim show?
I have no idea.
With the Meatwad and stuff like that. The neighbor's Carl. He just talks about Foreigner and stuff.
Oh, the one that had Danzig on it.
Yeah.
Speaking of, but basically the core that would keep going for a while with In Flames is going to be Jesper, Glenn, and Johan. That would kind of basically go up until Jester Reis, and that was the only core. And then that first record, Jesper actually played drums as well, so that's kind of like the multifaceted, you know, Nicky Anderson kind of approach of you know, songwriter, guitar player, and
that becomes like a weird pattern because the drummers then eventually in Flames often switch to guitar. Like Bjorn's going to do that later too. So kind of strange.
Yeah, and even on Jester Reis later on, he goes from, well, he's playing drums, but he also does lead guitar, which you don't often see in bands, I don't think.
And I think one of the odd things, you know, you hear it in Behind Space, and I think it's one of the maybe strengths and weaknesses of Lunar Strain is the sort of kitchen sink approach. You know, you can tell there's a lot of greenness to the band, and they're very like, you know, like they're trying to like think of as many ideas and throw as many ideas in as they possibly can.
It kind of reminds me of like early Megadeth records where there's like good choice tracks, but a lot of the time it's really uneven. Yeah. And there's the story that we were just talking about off mic.
Yeah, where they supposedly what happened is Wrong Again Records, which put out the first 3 In Flames, which is, you know, sort of a very choice cult label for people that, you know, have listened to our podcast. You know, we did
they only put out about, I think, 12 releases, maybe.
Yeah,
maybe less than that.
They did the War Comp, which we did an entire show on, early Eucharist Records, you know,
Arch Enemy, Expression, stuff like that.
But what happened is these guys, you know, Wrong Again Records, or War for short, heard their demo stuff and asked them like if they had a full length, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've got a full length." And so they had to like rush home and like record a bunch of this stuff very quickly. And so, you know, what you'll hear like in the next set is just sort of a mishmash of different sort of elements and ideas sort of thrown together, and you hear that in Behind Space, especially, you know, with the way that the song ends with, you know, kind of the Irish folk kind of ending for like a minute and a half, which...
And they're kind of... This was almost a kind of an extrapolation of what At the Gates did with that weird pseudo, like, folk-ish type elements, but not folk where, like, you know, like some of these... I'm trying to think of like a really bad folk metal band. I can't even think of them because I don't listen to them. Yeah. But they were actually bringing in that kind of aesthetic, like with the cello playing and stuff like that. And, you know, At the Gates had some of that in the earlier records, you know, with violin as well. But it was I think it was all kind of coming from that same well. But these guys, I think, were much more new wave of British heavy metal, you know, Iron Maiden, you know, power metal to some degree, not the stuff we think of power metal now, but
some Halloween,
you know, Halloween and stuff like
kind
that
of stuff going on,
coming in as well.
Yeah, and along, you know, I think you always have, when you're talking about the Gothenburg stuff like Tranquility and all that, you have to mention the German thrash stuff like Creator, Sodom, Destruction.
Teutonic.
You know, and you'll hear that, you know, in some of the stuff, you know, we'll listen to sort of later, you know.
Well, and Jesper's kind of, he was, I think, the founding member of the band, from best I can tell. But it was basically him and Glenn for a long time there. But his whole mission statement was like, bring in heavy metal, but with really harsh vocals, because at that point everybody's trying to carve out their own little, you know, subsection, because there's so much Swedish death metal from, you know, 89 to like 91 that it was hard to really, you know, carve out your own identity.
Sure. And I was saying to Monica before we recorded this, like how, you know, especially like a song like Behind Space, when I first heard that, it sort of remapped my mind in terms of what the possibilities of like death metal were, you know, because I was sold that this was death metal, you know, by like Chris and you and stuff like that, and I was kind of like, yeah, but it's got like an Irish folk part to it. It's got this like sing-along chant part in the middle with like triumphant guitar that just seems so counter to what I had perceived, I guess, as death metal at that point, which was Morbid Angel and Cannibal Corpse and Obituary.
Well, depending on who you ask, it's not death metal.
Yeah, and that's where the controversy lies, you know. I mean, where do you sort of see this stuff, like the early In Flames, compared to like the stuff that maybe you got into? Do you see it kind of similar, you know, when you go back and listen to the older stuff? Or
I mean, I don't have the same time frame on it that you do. So when I got into metal in general, I got into the more melodic stuff.
And I was kind of the same way, though. You know, I was gatewayed with like Opeth and things like that. Like that really grabbed me because, again, and I've talked about it before, and whether you agree with this or not, like to me it was this weird, like being a high school boy, it was the girlfriend angle. It was the justification that like I could like play Opeth or like this level of In Flames or something like that, and like kind of played around a girl, and she'd be like, really, this is death metal, you know, and like and she might be like slightly fascinated, or instead of like if I threw on Obituary, she's gonna be like, what the, you know,
what's this grunting and growling?
Yeah, that's the difference that what is it, like 4 years makes, is that there was that stuff when I was listening to it, girls could give two shits about death metal at all. It was like they like punk rock and goth, and then as soon as you get past that, it was like, no, it was just a total boys club at that point, because it was just all brutality and teenage angst come out of the music, really.
Did you ever run into that kind of resistance being a girl from northern Michigan, kind of small town, you know what I mean, like where people had like a strange perception of you as you're like entering into the world of extreme metal? Or
no, everybody was actually always pretty supportive of it. They were like, oh sweet, a girl that actually likes this music, that's really awesome. I think that they could tell that, you know,
it wasn't just because your boyfriend liked it, it was because you honestly liked it.
Yeah, there was a genuine interest in the music. It just, I had it from a young age. My mom turned me on to Megadeth when I was 8 years old, and then after that it was just kept on going up.
Everybody's got their gateway. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's cool.
Mine was Hall & Oates.
I do think it's really interesting, though, that you talk about like the kind of young angsty, because I looked up the ages of the guys, and when they released that first album, they were only about 20, 21 years old on average in the band.
And that's always been, I guess, especially this era, it's always been really typical of like the Swedish bands and the Finnish bands, because, you know, we've talked before about like, you know, with the national health or the sort of national services provided, that they had these places that you could go as like teenagers and like rooms full of instruments. And
sure, it was like, yeah, as part of your being a citizen of Sweden, you could go and check out a guitar, like we check out books from the library kind of thing. I mean, like, dismember when they recorded like Never Flowing Stream, they were still in high school.
Yeah,
but they had access to all
Eucharist.
this stuff.
Some of those guys were like 14, 15 when Velvet Creation.
Some of the stuff's just retarded. Which
Decapitated was 14 when they released their first album.
Yeah. So and so it is weird that like you could hear a song like Behind Space, which has very competent musicianship, you know, like great solos, like all kinds of stuff, and then you say, oh, this is their debut, and they're, you know, 19, 20 years old or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's where this, you know, like I said, the greenness kind of comes from, and it's kind of endearing in a way. I like that, you know, whereas they're not so polished all the time. You know, it's great to hear the polished stuff later, but there's something kind of endearing about ideas that sometimes don't stick or work, you know.
You're not as afraid to, like, fail at that point. You're just like, oh, I just want to make sure that I get this in there, and we got to do all of this, so...
Well, it's like, I can't play all these, like, chords and, like, you know, progressions and stuff, but I can play really fucking fast. So there we go.
Yeah.
You know, like that youthful like indiscretion is great.
Well, I think it's one of the things we'll talk about in the second part of this, you know, like in part 2, because with In Flames, their career is so big, we kind of had to break into a two-parter. And I think it's the idea in their early years, they weren't really afraid to make... They weren't like, I don't know. Today, I feel like they're making choices very deliberately to achieve a certain amount of success or mainstream sort of acceptance. And, you know, you got to eat. Everybody eventually is sick of, like, you know, sleeping on the bus and shit like that. And I get that, you know, but it doesn't mean that, like, we have to sort of all be on board with that, you know, if they're going to sort of mainstream themselves. And I don't bemoan that to anyone, you know, like, success is success. But it's just unfortunate that they had to almost, like, dumb some of that aspect down by going in the, like you said, Jonathan Davis kind of approach or whatever.
Definitely, you know, lost a little bit of creativity.
Jumpsuits and stupid shit like that. Yeah. You know, just.
But also those are, I mean, this is kind of consistent with a lot of like the Scandinavian stuff, is that these guys burn so quick that from album to album to album, it sounds like a different band almost. And then once they hit their, you know, their formative years a little bit later on, like Clayman, I think is where we first start to hear that, is then it's like, okay, we're making a living at this. We need to like find out what our identity is and stick to it, because that's all people want. They don't want this like experimentation and weirdness.
And like you're saying, more like calculated decisions instead of just like, I want to make sure that I get all of this in there, all of these ideas down. We were talking earlier, and I was reading a interview that the guitarist had done, and he was asked why they don't do more instrumental parts, and he said, well, you know, they don't fit. But it's funny because if you listen to Lunar Strain, that didn't cross his mind.
No, it fit weird.
He made it fit.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, they're doing competent, really great instrumentals, really all the way up through, Horacle and Colony, that like are memorable and people liked,
Oh, yeah.
So,
That was one of my favorite things about the band.
yeah, these are triumphant kind of instrumentals, which we'll sort of talk about more.
Well, that's kind of a novelty too. There's like not a ton of bands that did instrument outside of like the acoustic intro or whatever, but they actually did full songs that you didn't need vocals to really have the thing.
They
work.
told stories almost, in a cool way.
In a video game kind of way sometimes.
Yeah. And, Lunar Strain, like we said, is full of a lot of, varying ideas. And then this next set that we'll hear, we've got songs like, Starforsaken, which kind of starts with this sort of violin intro, which is pretty cool. And even some of the riffing is so simplistic. We were saying it kind of goes into like almost like a Sodomish Overkill Anthrax, like kind of like mosh type riff.
Yeah, I mean the breakdown at like it's like the 120 mark or something on that track is, I mean it's total just it's like a mosh breakdown. It's like Exodus or something, Exodus or Anthrax or something.
And then you hear the German thrash stuff at the very end, like kind of almost a destruction solo, just like real kind of aggressive and stuff. And then it goes into Everlost, which we kind of. Monica had a weird track listing, something like where the version you had like loaded the song titles in wrong. So some of the songs that she was picking out that she
Grace
wanted.
Notes for that.
Yeah, good old Grace Notes on iTunes. But we did end up realizing she wanted to play Everlost Part 2 or Part 1. I'm sorry, I think I still have it written down as Part 2 on there. But Everlost Part 1, which is the more doomier kind of aspect, not the one that has the female vocals. But that was another thing that was kind of interesting about these guys, really outside of Paradise Lost. And
What comes from the Celtic Frost school too.
Yeah, the Celtic Frost had done some female vocals mixed with sort of death metal kind of stuff.
And, yeah, Paradise Lost and Anathema post then. But this is I think a really different approach than what we'd heard up to that
It's more
point.
Irish, like folk kind of like vocals
Gaelic
rather
kind of
than
vibe.
like gothic vocals mixed in.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Definitely, Gaelic vibe kind of thing. And you hear that with Starforsaken. And a song we're not playing actually is Horglaten. And if I'm sure I butchered that plenty, but it was actually kind of taken off of a theme from a 70s prog rock band from Sweden called Kebnekaise, Electric Mountain, which is actually a really killer record. If you get a chance to hear it, it has a great guitar player named Kenny Hankinson, who played on Bo Hansen.
Magician's Hat.
Not a Magician's Hat.
Okay, that's the one I have.
No, Magician's Hat. Yeah.
Okay.
Not the Lord of the Rings is what I meant.
Yeah.
So there's a little prog knowledge out there for you, for you Opeth fans that like your Swedish prog from the 70s. But anyways, Everlost part 1 that we're going to hear is probably the most gloomy, doomy song that these guys may have ever written in terms of just sort of downtrodden. I mean,
It's a lot of minor chords, and later, as far as the further we go into the their kind of discography, it's all this major triumphant man of war-ish kind of like like riding a steed, galloping kind of stuff. And, and this is just really
this is like
gloomy.
Bride, Paradise Lost, Peaceville kind of
totally
gloom type stuff. And I guess out of the Swedish bands of this era, Sky Dancer from Dark Tranquility has some somber moments, kind of reflective moments and things. But this is for, I think, In Flames, kind of a rarity, so it's kind of a cool tune to pick. And then we'll sort of end our stuff with Lunar Strain with Upon an Oaken Throne, which is, sort of short but sweet, but nice.
Death Angel board riff.
Yeah.
See if you can pick that out. Yeah. Like almost exactly.
And then what we'll sort of meld into is, speaking of instrumentals, we've got one of our first instrumentals we'll be playing, which is Timeless from Subterranean EP, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Subterranean EP when we come back. But Timeless will blend into Biosphere, which is a nice way to sort of close a set because it closes the Subterranean EP. Monica, do you have any particular thoughts you wanted to throw about any of these songs? Because I know you were kind of writing notes and different things earlier.
Nothing in particular. I would like to be more... I kind of guess I wrote Subterranean off a little bit, didn't listen to it a whole lot. My favorites were Horacle and Lunar Strain. So I didn't really pay attention to that album until I was sitting here with you earlier today and listening to it. And then I'm like, why did I do that?
And we sort of caught you. I think I caught you off guard right away when I was like, Mark and I will probably tell you that Subterranean's our favorite. And you're like, really? Like, I don't even like listen. And so... Yeah, it is kind of a weird gem because it's an EP, and I think a lot of people dismiss EPs and bands' careers off.
I definitely do.
This is such a it's very focused and concise, and I'm sure you'll start to hear that just
it's
from
where I think
Biosphere.
the first time where they really kind of like gel is like have an identity as a band too.
Yeah, for sure.
Consistent
Even though none of the guys that were in the band almost were part of the band. After
No, outside of those three dudes,
Yeah, so pretty funny. But so we've got Starforsaken, Everlost Part 1, Upon an Oaken Throne, Timeless, and Biosphere.
Take me
That was Biosphere, Timeless, Upon an Oaken Throne, Everlost, and Starforsaken. And that last tune you heard, the last full tune, besides the instrumental there, Biosphere, comes from the aforementioned Subterranean, which, Monica, you were talking about kind of having a renewed spirit towards. And I think it maybe does strike people as odd that, you and I both, I think, agree. And maybe Chris, I feel like Chris is in the same camp as well, that, like, we all three have always loved Subterranean as, like, the most, like, complete encapsulated sort of work of art, Yeah,
and usually EPs are not necessarily, they're a lot of, I think EPs are like thrown in the same category as like singles.
Yeah.
To where people sometimes throw them away, but
I think back in like the early like years of death metal, like EPs meant a little bit more because, for instance, for me, like outside of Clandestine, and I know that Crawl EP from Entomb might be like the most perfect 3 songs that Entombed ever like put together in a weird sense.
Well, even like My Dying Bride, I'm the Bloody Earth EP. Like their EPs were like almost back in the day were like people either like that's where you like came together and got cohesive, or you could experiment.
You did a weird transitional sort of statement with it.
Yeah, because like I Am the Bloody Earth had like weird dub remixes and stuff of like GGFH versions of dub versions of Bride and stuff like that.
But I think like we were mentioning before with how rushed something like Lunar Strain was because they had to lie to the studio. You get something with Subterranean, which is they actually got some time to sit down and write some cohesive songs that were thematic and linked together. And you hear that on Biosphere, there's a lot of like repetitive themes, and instead of like the kitchen sink approach, which I think is one of the criticisms you get with Lunar Strain, is that the riffs almost switch too quickly. They're like trying to throw too many like different like movements and parts into songs.
Sure.
You get more consistency, and you'll hear that in the 2 songs that we still have to play from Subterranean, which is Stand Ablaze and Subterranean, where there's like themes like on each song, and they keep coming back to that theme, and that really becomes something important, I think, for
they start understanding songwriting.
Yeah.
Chorus verse, kind of like traditional pop songwriting kind of stuff, but bring it into the metal, genre.
And then what I think happens later with Jester Reis is they take the understanding of good songwriting and then they expand the melodic elements even further, to things like Moonshield and Jester's Dance, which, I mean, they're really reaching for the sky. The harshness kind of starts to come out of the music a little bit, because even in Subterranean vocally, and who's singing on Subterranean here?
Subterranean, we've got Hanky Force
from Dawn. And Dawn's a kind of a personal favorite of mine, and they're sort of in the same camp as like Dissection.
But nobody knows who they are.
Yeah, Swedish Black Death kind of thing. Like in the Marduk Dissection kind of boat. Almost. And then we also have, are there some other new members on Subterranean besides...
on Subterranean, it's another mishmash where we've got Daniel Erlendenson. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, you may have heard of that guy before. I'm pretty sure he drummed for Eucharist and... Arch Enemy. Yeah.
And then we also have Anders Djarp from... Or we're just going to say Anders from Dark Tranquility.
Okay.
And then,
is that Anders Javarp? Is that how it's spelled? Or am I thinking of the wrong Anders? There's
Javarp. But I don't know if it's like a quick... Javarp kind of thing. Who knows at this point? But he's
we're gonna get angry fan letters once again.
But the weird thing, like he's so known for just Dark Tranquility. He hasn't done a whole lot outside of that. And he's a great drummer, but he's also almost like how Adrian from At the Gates was like very like almost robotic and like really played on the beat, very
really
like,
tight,
precise and tight. He's kind of like in that same school as well, but they managed somehow to have like a cohesiveness, even though they have 2 different drummers, and
And then the Jester's Reis, they're gonna have a 3rd drummer. So just like 3 drummers on 3 albums and 3 vocalists on 3 albums. I mean, I don't know. Maybe if you were a betting person, you might not have thought that In Flames would have been the band that would have ever grown to become the biggest deal of this whole scene.
Sure.
They just look like a kind of a mess of like who the hell's really in this band.
Yeah, losing a vocalist or changing vocalists is usually a kiss of death for bands. Like, I mean, look at like Iron Maiden, for instance. Like Blaze Bayley comes in and they lose a lot of fans, but there's also that instance in the same case in Iron Maiden where you go from Paul Di'Anno to Dickinson, where they changed their whole
I think if it happens early enough in a band's career, the band's so young that people aren't like completely endeared. You know what I mean?
Death metal I think has a little bit more leeway because it's not like such a signature voice usually.
You're not hooking on to like a harmony that like somebody does. Yeah, I think that's true. But I also think it's weird, and maybe in my mind, when I think of In Flames, Lunar Strain, and Subterranean, I think of these as big records for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I also have to remember that to most of the world, In Flames was still very underground and like almost unknown. Still.
Well, yeah, Jester Reis is really where they got on the map because Warhead distribution was pretty low at that point. Like they were, $25 imports when we were getting them back in the day. So,
and they'll sign with War will sign a pretty lucrative deal with Nuclear Blast to sort of like co-release Jester Reis domestically through Nuclear Blast, which is kind of where the band kind of explodes, really. But I remember you guys giving me a tape that you guys got of Jester Reis before it came out, and it had like demo versions of like Dead Eternity and some other stuff on it. It was pretty cool, and like being able to play that before Jester Reis even came out on CD. So in our sphere, like we knew In Flames really well. Like In Flames was just like one of those bands like you talked about in our group of like 10 people.
Sure. Well, I think we put like more importance on them than anybody else just because we had like those extra versions. Same with like a band like Cardinal Sin, which actually shares some members of In Flames, which a lot of other bands do as well. But like Ceremonial Oath, and then actually around this, a little bit after this time, was Dimension Zero, which was Glenn, and who else was in Dimension Zero? I don't think Jesper was.
No, I don't think Jesper was either.
Yeah, whatever. But basically, as soon as like around Jester Reis era, when they started going more melodic, Dimension Zero was the answer to the more barbaric earlier kind of stuff, where they went back and just this totally cutthroat, super fast, yet melodic, but still had like that kind of barbarity that they were kind of like shedding a little bit at this point.
Now, Monica, you've said that Jester Reis is for you one of your favorite In Flames records. What is it that I guess for you that stands out or grabs your appeal, having gone backwards towards the band? Starting with Colony and then moving back to these older records.
I just thought that it was really, it was well done. Obviously, this is, after the coming off that EP. It's funny you were talking about the EP because you're talking about how you guys were involved in actively listening to this band at the time, whereas I go backwards. I think that might have been one of the reasons why I skipped the EP is because, it seems like they released that EP the next year after Lunar Strain, and then they didn't release Jester Reis until the year after, so that EP seems like we're trying to keep up the momentum where this aspiring band, which it
did for like you said, the small group of people that were into In Flames.
But I think the Jester Reis is the first album for me that really defines the sound of In Flames that appealed to me, which was that kind of really melodic, and there was a lot of the instrumental and the acoustic and a couple songs there where like he had some female vocals and stuff. So I think that was just what really appealed to me, is that was kind of a new thing for me, kind of a nice transitional band from going from more mainstream to going more underground. The melody and everything appealed to me.
What were you, Mark and I so much have kind of gotten autobiographical on the podcast, but what were you jumping out of into when you first heard this style of music, this like sort of melodic, Swedish death metal kind of stuff? Where were you coming from?
I was coming more from the the metal magazines. They had like Sepultura, Slipknot, all that stuff was getting big, that kind of teetering on the
extreme side.
Yeah, teetering, exactly. And this is a nice transition there because it's extreme, but it's still approachable and accessible, I think.
Something to grab onto, and it's not just completely like over the top, ridiculously harsh. Like there's something you can pull out of it,
It's not,
I was definitely taking a nosedive at the time into more extreme metal. I was interested in going that way, and so that was kind of like a nice segue.
Yeah, was there any validity for you having, hearing like the melodicism, where you could kind of like say like, oh man, like a lot of people dismiss death metal, but like there's so much, you could just hear the melodies and musicianship.
Oh, I loved it.
It
was the musicianship. I felt it was pretty superior to a lot of the stuff that I had been listening to, and that appealed to me. I've never been a musician. I've never been able to play an instrument, but I've always been able to appreciate that artistic talent and like creativity, throwing new ideas out there and yet making it work.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I being another non-musician, whereas Mark, you have some rudimentary understanding.
Yeah, I dabble.
I understand what I like about music, in a pretty profound, deep way.
I have the kind of exuberance that the young In Flames had at 18, 19, 20, but I'm much older.
The kitchen sink approach of ideas, or
just that I know what my limitations are, and I just like exploit that.
There you go.
Yeah.
I
have no illusions of doing anything outside. This is like my only hobby is playing music.
Yeah.
Everything else is serious.
Another thing I would say too is I was listening to a lot of American music, and so this was my first foray into something. I was like, wait, bands overseas listening to that's weird, you know. And so there was this almost with the Jester Reis, this sort of like whimsy, like it almost sounded like it was from a different time, and it was so completely foreign to me.
Sure, yeah.
I loved it. It really played onto my imagination.
Well, it's like, back in the day, me and Chris, that was the big thing, is like, Sweden was a country we'd never heard of outside of ABBA and like Ingmar Bergman or something. Like that was the only export out of that country, and they're like, they have this huge death metal scene. Like, how is this? It's so weird.
It's like a world unfolding that existed, but you never knew was
exactly.
It had been like functioning like very well.
Well, that was my entry point into even like understanding European politics. Like I didn't care until that point, and then I got like an interest in like socialized Sweden and all the stuff worked, and ended up like got my dad into like checking out Swedish culture based on this music. Yeah, he could care give two shits about the music, but me showing this interest in a country like that, he'd like rent documentaries and read books about the stuff at that point. So
yeah, I think I became kind of Sweden obsessed as well, in terms of like reading articles on like how socialism worked there, and it was just like seemed to kind of like fascinate me that this
it was like a more interesting Canada.
Yeah, it was like it's like
that's a very good way to put that.
It's like this weird perfect society in the north where everyone seemed happy and they had just shitloads of death metal. Like it was just, it didn't make any. I was like, oh, perfect.
But it's also like fairly affluent, so you don't have anything to rebel against. It's not like reggae or punk we had in the States or the UK. But it was these kids that they were bored, and they wanted to rebel against
conformity. And suburban.
Yeah, like black
socialism.
Metal in Norway was the same kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, then, I mean, that opens up the discussion for the In Flames lyrics, because, their lyrics tended to be more just, like, philosophical, like, on humanity in general.
Yeah, kind of cosmic, and, they weren't, like, violent. That's the weird part about, like, I guess the melodic death metal bands is, like, none of them were talking about like killing and murdering and the stuff that like Dismember and Entomb and Obituary and everyone else.
Well, Cannibal Corpse and Suffocation. It was all about like brutality against people.
And it wasn't even really like occult lyrics either. You know what I mean? Like there wasn't like the satanic edge that Morbid Angel had, or things like that. It was like you said, like more introspective, philosophical, kind of like cosmic-y. Well, coming out of a culture where they've got a much more broad educational system as well, where it's not just like here's your Christian dogma, go with this. Sure. Yeah. So, but I think, as we approach this first trio of songs from Jester Reis to sort of, approach near the end of part one here, I think what you'll hear, like with a song like Moonshield and Jester's Dance, they kind of go hand in hand. They're sort of the opening two, songs of the record.
Moonshield back in the day when we first heard that, because that was actually put out on a couple comps before.
Beauty and Darkness,
which sounds like a terrible name, but it's one of the best comps out there.
It's got some amazing,
great fantastic stuff. But hearing that, we're just completely blown away by that. Nope, we'd never heard that sound.
It was a new level of melodicism in metal. I mean, it went further than I think even what, like, at this point we might have heard Opeth Orchid, which seemed like just kind of a crazy conception of melodicism and death metal,
but a completely different.
Yeah, this was like in a pop rock song kind of sense. Had like these sweeping like great sing along kind of melodies.
And going from these minor chords to like major stuff where everything sounded triumphant, like Iron Maiden ish. Too, which was kind of bizarre, I think different at this time.
I think that's probably where you have to. I mean, from Jester Reis forward, and even you hear a little bit of hints of it in Subterranean. Like, really, these guys are kind of the death metal Iron Maiden. For at least for this middle period of their career. Like, this is the first record where I think they've actually, like, you look back at, like, listen to their stuff now, and you go back to Jester Reis, and that's where they became In Flames that we know now. Yeah, and that's what you were saying too. Yeah, that's what Monica was kind of mentioning before. And an interesting story about Moonshield. A friend of Mark and I's who just got married last year was my high school sweetheart, and when we were at prom together, this was her favorite song, like hands down. This and strangely enough, Fall of Man from Arcturus. Okay, go figure, wrap your head around that one. But when we were at prom together, she actually asked the DJ, and this is how exuberant and brave she is compared to me. I was chicken shit. I would have been like, I couldn't face the disappointment of seeing people at prom being like, what the fuck is this? So like, but she just didn't care. She's like, hey, I have this CD out in the car. Could you play it? And he's like, I guess. And he put on Moonshield and it was like record scratch, like everybody kind of stopped, like, what is happening? And it was kind of great. And then he kind of did a cross crossfade about 2.5 minutes into it into something else. But still, I can say, hey, we got Moonshield from In Flames played at my high school prom. That's
more than I can say about mine.
Minor accomplishment. But
also, just real quick before we go, check out the music, is that this is our first entry of Anders Frieden coming in as a vocalist /
it's kind of important for this band, I guess, to mention.
And I think he really kind of steers a lot of the direction of the band a lot. And then we've got the core of Glenn, Jesper, and Johan, but then Bjorn Gillette comes in as the drummer and also does lead guitar on this as well, which is a interesting combination.
Yeah, and he's going to eventually give up the drums for just straight guitar on later records and stuff. So, but yeah, Moonshield and Jester's Dance, a great 1-2 punch. Any thoughts on either of these? These are two that you picked out as well, like that we all kind of agreed on. Moonshield and Jester's Dance.
When I heard Moonshield, it was also a time that I was getting into like that first Demons and Wizards album came out. So I was really into that, like you were talking about, like folk, melodic, thrown into metal. Just made me really happy.
Yeah.
So that song really stood out to me. But once again, that's the reason the whole album stood out to me.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's great. So, and then we'll sort of close out. So we've got Stand Ablaze and Subterranean from Subterranean EP. Then we got Moonshield, Jester's Dance, and the title track, Jester's Reis, from Jester Reis. That was Jester's Race, Jester's Dance, Moonshield, Subterranean, and Stand Ablaze. And we're kind of closing in on part one here, the end. And this is, I guess, for a lot of people, I would imagine, this is maybe where some people stop listening to In Flames. And that's something in part two we're definitely going to get into, is the controversy over, are they death metal? When do they stop being this band that's well respected, and when do they, and I think
Jester Race itself is kind of a divisive record.
Yeah, it could be.
That the first couple, record, or the first record and the first EP, I think had a certain cult.
Yeah, and they're underground
factor
enough.
to it,
and this kind of blew up a little bit in terms of extreme metal.
Did. Yeah.
And I think when you hear a song like Jester's Dance and Moonshield, which we just heard, I think some people just couldn't handle how melodic and catchy and Iron Maidenish some of that was.
Yeah.
Which I think is funny, because I think now a band like Iron Maiden is so appreciated that you almost love hearing any melodies mixed in. Even when there's extreme metal bands like Cannibal Corpse that do Iron Maidenisms now sometimes, and it that's acceptable. But back then, it was
this is like bringing
dangerous.
a anthemic nature to songs of death metal, which was kind of not, it was kind of unheard of outside of At the Gates was pushing the thrash envelope with the catchiness and bringing kind of Slayer elements in, but I think In Flames kind of went a complete had with that same aesthetic, kind of went a little bit different direction, even more anthemic and catchy.
I think Jester Race is a strange litmus test, because it's an indicator of this forthcoming power metal movement that's about to sweep European metal through Hammerfall, and even even the power metal isms and wankisms, if you will, of Children of Bodom out of Finland. So this whole thing is going to sort of sweep over. Blind Guardian becoming mainstream, and the Rhapsodies, if we dare go there. But I mean, that stuff was huge, say what you want, in the late 90s, early 2000s. It really became a lot more traditional metal. Well, and I think they were almost ahead of the curve.
Because actually right after Jester Race, Jesper and Glenn, both guitar players, actually Jesper went on to do drums for Hammerfall, and Glenn did guitar along with Oscar from Crystal
Oscar
Age.
Drumjuk, who did some guest vocals on Subterranean, some guest
and Lunar
vocals, and Lunar Strain. Yeah.
But yeah, they were I think they were kind of edging that way at that point, and that was really being around. I still have pictures of my old apartment where I've got a Hammerfall poster.
Yeah,
and that it was the record that
Legacy of the Kings poster.
Yeah. So and it was just at the time that kind of stuff was just surging up as undeniable. This is something that's going to start
it's early metalcore really happening. I still am endeared to that first initial error, and then there's a tipping point, a balancing point where it just all of a sudden it just got grotesque, and it was oh, too much, run away.
Sure. For me with power metal, it goes from Hammerfall to the first Primal Fear record, and then I'm done.
Yeah,
that's all I needed.
Yeah, the Blind Guardian stuff, which
I don't throw in the same camp really. That's more traditional metal.
Yeah. So, but we do have, speaking of triumphant power metal-ish type aspects, we're sort of closing with one of the great instrumentals.
One of the two instrumentals from this record.
Yeah, we heard Jester's Dance already, and so we're going to end with Wayfarer. And I don't know, you could describe this as...
Well, I think Monica made it a pretty good comparison that it sounds like it sounds like a video game level that you're doing at certain points.
I thought I should have been playing Sonic when I was listening to it.
Well, there's kind of a 80s action montage movie kind of quality to it.
There's a little bit of Van Halen. Yeah.
Some Metallica, definite Justice for All, kind of da-da-da-da-da,
Yeah.
It's cool. It's fun, and
it's got a sense of humor.
It represents an era when the In Flames was able to sort of have fun with this,
not take themselves too seriously. They didn't have too much invested. They weren't necessarily trying to make a living off of this and tour the world, so they could, It
was before they did their Inner Turmoil lyrics and all that garbage. So it was still just ridiculous, over the top, mythical kind of thing.
And like you said, it's the imagery of two guitar players back to back on stage, bending at the elbows. And there's something beautiful about that. It's metal.
You can picture, all these guys, like brothers in arms, is the Hammerfall song, are fighting tonight. The forces of steel meet again.
Yeah.
But they could. It's one of those few bands where you could see these guys, everybody's smiling when they're playing. It wasn't the scowling, the holding the invisible oranges kind of thing.
No, it's more like a humble nod.
Yeah, everybody's just we're part of the same. Everybody's rejoicing in metal kind of thing. So it's. I think that this record was definitely either people like were on for the ride or they were done with In Flames at this point.
Funny little tidbit: the Jester Reis is considered one of the greatest metal albums of all time, ranked number 79 on Metal Rules list of 100 greatest metal albums.
And who knows the validity of Metal Rules, but at least it's and it's definitely
it's interesting.
I think it's probably the one record. If there was a record that was going to be in Decibel's Hall of Fame, it'd probably be Jester's Reis, just because it's that crossroads album. Even if like the early people loved Lunar Strain more and the later people loved Colony more, Jester's Reis is like that
one that can
right there, right in the middle. Like
Well, and this is what like I don't think like Children of Bodom would really exist without this record.
No.
You know, that's kind of like, jumping, taking that formula, like, okay, here's what's possible. Now go fucking ape shit with it. Go Yngwie Malmsteen Rising Force meets Randy Rhoads, and then here we go.
Yeah. And you'll hear it on Wayfarer. It's definitely kind of a wanking fest in a sense, but in a good way. Good way. But well, thank you, Monica, for joining us for part 1, and we're gonna
thank you for having me.
We're gonna grab your expertise definitely a lot more in part 2, where you're gonna enlighten us about some of the things that Mark and I are more jaded on, probably.
Yes.
So
it's a polite way to say it.
I look forward to it.
But let us know what you thought. Shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com, or check us out on iTunes. Leave us a comment. Facebook, Mark and Jason, or go to the website requiempodcast.com, where you could also donate and become an executive producer.
I'd like to thank we just the web domain hosting came back, it came due this year, and luckily we had enough donations to cover that. So
hot damn,
thank you very much.
Hot damn, we didn't have to do a corner beg like we usually do sometimes.
It just comes out of my pocket, but
So but anyhow, so enjoy part 1 of In Flames. We got Wayfarer here to end things from Jester Reis. I'm Mark.
All right, I'm Jason,
and I'm Monica.